Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Carl, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
I'm very good, thank you.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us. I love speaking with people such as yourself who have had such a long career, but now you sit in a senior leadership team within one of the UK Fire and Rescue Service. And for people coming in, because we're having such a massive turnover in staff now, we're recruiting so much in the UK Fire and Rescue Service, and there's people who have different expectations of what they might want from their career. Some people want progression, some don't. So I always think it's nice to see somebody in your position and then try and connect the dots, kind of looking backwards.
Yeah.
So before we get into it, could you just give us a little background on sort of where you grew up, sort of family dynamics, siblings, all that sort of stuff?
Where I grew up, I grew up in Cornwall. It was interesting because I come from a single parent family originally. My mother remarried later. Because I think some people do look at people in positions of leadership and high up in organisations and think, or maybe it's a misplaced perception, but they may think, oh, these people have had a privileged career or privileged upbringing. It didn't. My mother split from my father, and me and my brother ended up living or sleeping in a cupboard of a caravan, and my mother was sleeping on the sofa for 2 years of her parents' caravan.
Jesus.
It wasn't until a health worker come round and said, you can't have children sleeping in a cupboard, we actually got moved into social housing. So it was quite an interesting upbringing. We didn't have any money. Everything we had was second hand. And you just got on with it. You just, but we didn't know any different. That was life.
I was about to say, when people say about deprivation, and in our job, sometimes you walk into situations of socio-economic depravity and you're like, oh my Lord, how can people... But when you're a child, it's that innocence, isn't it? Because you know no different.
Yeah.
Were you grateful for what you have? Did you have because you must have also seen what other children had. Were you part of a normal school or...?
It was interesting because in those younger years, and oddly enough, I can recall quite a lot, and some people do look at me, it's like, how can you recall that far back? But, those memories are seared into my brain, and...
Because they're emotive as well sometimes. When there's a lot of emotion attached to something, I always think it cuts a little bit deeper.
Yeah, maybe. But I remember it. It wasn't an unhappy childhood. I remember we were very strict. The interesting thing I do recall is when I became older, I remember looking at other people, mates. I'd go around their parents' houses and think their family dynamics are different. There wasn't a lot of... We weren't what I would say a loving family. It was an existing family. And it was really interesting. And then my mother later remarried, and so I had a stepfather. And then the dynamics changed. So I was actually adopted as well. So my surname isn't my birth name, and not a lot of people really know that.
What age did that happen?
I was about 10. I remember it because I was still at primary school. It was just before I went on to secondary school.
Did they ask you about it? Because these day and age, you'd probably think people, even at that young age.
No, they did ask you about it, but it was almost you wouldn't challenge it because I remember a social worker coming round to the house and they sort of asked you, but at 10, do you really know? You just go with the flow, don't you? And it changed. It's interesting because it does change your identity somewhat.
Obviously, it changed in terms of your name, but did you feel any different after it had changed?
Well, my initial name's Brown, my surname, and this is the irony. Kids being kids, and it was back in the 70s, and that Boney M song was on in the charts, "Brown Girl in the Ring." So,
I remember it.
Going back a long way, and a lot of the other children used to tease you at school with it. So in a way, when my name changed, there was no longer that link to. An avenue for being ridiculed.
Kids are cruelly creative, though. They will find something.
So it did sort of change my identity, probably for the better, without me realising. And then I never really thought anything about it after that. And you just got on with life. Did
that change the dynamic of where you were living? Because I'm assuming you then was this person, kind of not like a hero concept, but my partner was single after some very violent relationships for like 17 years, and she's lovely, but she also developed a callousness, almost like out of a survival ability, like because your mum had to be dad had to be mom, had to be disciplinarian, affectionist, and then she didn't have to be all of those things anymore. She had somebody to support her, I suppose, maybe?
Yeah, I don't think it was anything like that. I mean, to put it in context, when my stepfather came along, it wasn't a father, it was someone who happened to be married to my mother in the context. Now we're all adults, the relationship's different. But those sort of first years or later years of primary school and then those teenage years weren't necessarily great years in terms of a family unit. We didn't necessarily go without as such. We weren't a wealthy family. I mean, I remember when I was in I was in my late teens, and we lost the house we lived in because of the recession and all the bits and pieces that went on there, and so there was a lot of stresses. And so, you know, my childhood certainly wasn't a privileged one, but it wasn't the worst one either.
How old was your other sibling? Was he?
My brother, he's 18 months older than me.
Okay.
And then subsequently, I've got a half sister and half brother that came along. And my sister's 6 years younger than me, and my other half brother's 9 years younger than me, which was an interesting dynamic because, you know, as a 9-10-year-old, I could see all the issues and all the stresses about having a newborn baby in the house.
Yeah.
And people say, "What do you mean?" Well, I can remember my mother washing the nappies. I can remember my sister getting whooping cough. I can remember all these things happening.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it's an adult experience by proxy because there's a gap of 10 years almost. It's happening to you, whereas most kids wouldn't experience that. And I suppose there is families out there still where there's a large age difference between siblings, and they might do, but most people didn't. You know, all my friends at school didn't have such an experience, but you just got on with it, and that was life. So yeah, that was my upbringing.
Today's podcast was in partnership with our good friends Johnny and the team over at William Wood Watches. Now, if you're not familiar by now, William Wood was the name of his grandfather. He was a firefighter in the British Fire Service for over 25 years, stationed in Newcastle on the Blue Watch. Now, his grandson Johnny is a great friend of the podcast and came up with William Wood Watches to honour his grandfather and the legacy of firefighters all around the world. Now, some pretty cool updates from the William Wood Watch team. When it comes to their chivalrous collection, this August they came out with, honestly, one of my favourite looks for it. They came out with the gun metal for the face of the watch. Now, if you go over there and look at their watches, they've of course got the Jubilee, the Triumph, the Valium, the Bronze, but if you look at the chivalrous range, this is effectively the luxury dress range. It's got that sleek case, the luxury finish, and you can wear it on absolutely any occasion. I myself, I've said on the podcast before, I'm a massive fan personally of the Valiant collection. I've got the red watch, always with the red strap. Now, they do come with a selection of straps as well. And honestly, for me, the straps is probably one of the most favourite parts of it. It really is the one that catches everybody's eye. It's what draws you into it. And when you receive your William Wood watch, that whole unboxing experience is actually kind of special. Whether or not you get the fire alarm box or the VIP roll, usually comes, I think, with 3 different straps. However, I do know, I think it is if you get the Triumph collection, which is the Swiss precision watch made in Switzerland, you actually get that really unique fire alarm box as well that comes with it. Now that thing is absolutely stunning. You know the types you see in buildings where it says break glass on the front of it? That, honestly, it's been made into this luxury leather-bound box. You open that bad boy up, you see all the straps, you see the bottom compartment where you get the encasing watch. Pretty sure it comes with the cufflinks as well. And again, if you go over to their website, williamwoodwatches.com, you'll see that this company really does support firefighters all over the world. I think to date they are over £75,000 they've contributed to firefighter charities all over the world. So head on over and check it out. Have a look at the chivalrous first. They've got a chocolate range on there, but for me, the gunmetal one, if you're going to have a look at the gunmetal, that looks absolutely fantastic. The Triumph is probably my favourite, and I'm saving up for that one at the minute, but I have got the Valiant collection myself, and I absolutely love it. Johnny and the team are really making some moves with William Wood watches, doing some great things for our sector. Now back to the show. Did you ever have any envy sort of for the younger siblings? Because their childhood would have been different to yours. Because I sometimes see it when you see when I see my parents interact with my children, sometimes I feel like, you were never that way with me. You know, I never had that time or that affection from you. There's a little bit of that for me personally. I don't know. Yeah,
exactly that. Even my mother admitted, once me and my older brother had sort of grown up, I think we must have been in our sort of late 20s. I remember admitting that maybe she was too hard on me and my brother. It was almost like, I don't know whether it was, but it almost felt like, okay, well, that first family's not worked out. I'm resetting and going with a brand new family. And so my younger brother and sister, that was the 2.4 kids, the nuclear family, as it were. Me and my brother were on the periphery. And the interesting thing, I said, when I used to go around other people's houses, I remember that they were quite affectionate to their kids. They didn't want their kids to move out. We were told, when are you moving out?
Yeah,
and it was quite a traumatic time, And in fact, I won't repeat the words that my mother said to me, but basically it was get out of this house as soon as I was old enough. So I remember sleeping on a friend's sofa for a few weeks, and then I managed to find a flat and move on with my life.
What did you do what was one of your first jobs? What did you do for work as a kid?
I started off actually. I did a lot of part-time jobs when I was still in school. So I did a paper round, and I worked for a builder on holidays and on weekends. And I remember I used to get 50 pence an hour as a labourer, and it was. But you never thought anything. It was money. It was money. So all of my friends didn't have that. And then when I left school, I was offered 2 jobs by the builder I was working for and another builder who happened to be the father of one of my friends, and I took that job as an apprenticeship. But it was an interesting time because I was bullied. I mean, there was a guy on there in his sort of mid-20s. I was sort of 16, and he would find it funny. You'd be in a trench digging out. He'd come along and lift you up by your hair and drag you out the trench. And I couldn't carry on with that. So I left, and then I started a YTS. As a motor mechanic. So my first proper job, I would say, because the building didn't feel like a proper job, probably because I didn't want to be there because of all the bullying. Yeah. So I became a motor mechanic.
See, I kept doing those sorts of rubbish jobs for probably a bit too long. And in fairness, my whole man has run a building firm for 40 years, so I kind of had like a different angle on it where I could see that it was kind of a thing. But you're right, in those types of roles, and I worked in warehouses and say filling skips of rubbish and just horrible jobs, and it did do a lot of character building though, and this is something that I'd love to ask your opinion on, because we're in a state now, I almost call it mental fragility that we're in now, which is actually probably a little bit harsh, but we are definitely developing differently psychologically, for better in many ways, but also I fear it's kind of one of those things, you have to go through something to callous the mind a little bit, but almost you don't want anybody to go through the bad thing. But it does develop you as a character. How did that develop you as a character? And do you think people are still getting those same experiences now?
In terms of do I think people are getting those same experiences, I think as a society, and I've seen it through the younger generation coming through the workforce, I think people are more willing to speak up when they feel they're not being treated fairly, and rightly so, especially around bullying. Mm-hmm. In terms of did it affect me, I think it did build up a reasonable amount of resilience. Mm-hmm. It's interesting because you said what was my first job. I was a motor mechanic at, I did the building trade for just under sort of a year, and then I started this YTS to become a motor mechanic. And then I joined the retained fire service in Cornwall, and I was 18 at the time. Yeah. And I think my experiences through school, I was bullied a bit at school. I was bullied when I got into work. And it's an interesting dynamic. Growing up in Cornwall was rather strange because there was seen like bullying. Everywhere in society, a form of bullying happened. Now, there's an interesting part to this, because I remember there was one person in the town I grew up in. He used to bully people. The kids always bully the younger kids. Interestingly, he was later, more recently, in the fire service in Cornwall retained, and has been dismissed for bullying and harassment. So wow. That to me is an interesting dynamic, isn't it?
How sad that you can never change that. Oh, you can change that behaviour, but how sad that. Because I suppose you will get rewarded when you get repeated. Some people can bully their way through process and through life, and they kind of feel like they're rewarded for it, so they just keep continuing the behaviour until somebody really challenges them.
Well, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because you've got to ask, why does that person do it? Are they a product of their environment, or is it their own inferiorities, their own experience of bullying? And I don't know in this case, but it is interesting. But coming back to the question you asked about resilience, I think it did make me resilient, because my career started in the fire service as a retained firefighter, and I really enjoyed it. And the reason I got into the fire service was I was dating a girl, and in a town called Foy. Some listeners may be familiar with Foy. Quite a nice town. That's where I went to secondary school. And I was dating this girl, and I didn't really know anything about the fire service. I'd seen them. I used to go past the local fire station in the town I grew up, which was retained, and her dad was a retained firefighter, and he'd get called out, and I thought, I quite like that. It looks good. And I was working in a town called Wadebridge at the time, and there was no chance of me becoming retained. But I'd said to my boss, I would quite like to have a look at that, and it wasn't one of those things. But my YTS was coming to an end. My boss couldn't carry on employing me because of the business wasn't doing that well. So I was told I was being basically, in inverted commas, made redundant, the YTS. So I had to take a couple of days off, and I went round every garage in all the local towns, knocking on the doors, saying, "Can I have a job? Can I have a job?" Yeah. And I got one in the town I lived in. And that to me is a part of, actually, it doesn't matter what hand you're dealt in life, you have a choice in what you can do with it. And my personal character is, okay, if I'm, if things aren't going my way, I've got two choices. I can sit back and wallow in pity or say it's not my fault and blame everyone else, or do I get up and do something about it? And I got this job in this garage, and unfortunately, just before I got that job, a friend of mine, in fact, it was a couple of years before, sorry, I'll go back. My friend of mine, we were all messing around as kids, and one of my friends, his father had bought him a Mini to learn to drive in, but we all weren't old enough at the time. Anyway, one night, four of them got into this Mini, and I was due to get into this Mini car, but I turned up late and missed my ride, as it were. And unfortunately, they took the car out, lost control, and had a serious accident. And one of my friends actually died in that car accident. I was 16, I remember it vividly. Terrible time. The other lad who was driving the car actually ended up going to prison. And but the whole point was, and the reason I mention that is because I knew that some of the people who'd gone to the incident as the firefighters. So I was working in the garage, and this guy would come in a couple of years later. And I said to him, "Oh, you're in the fire service, aren't you?" And I was interested in joining it. And the local fire service in the town I grew up in, a place called Lostwithiel, they were crying out for retained firefighters. So he said, "Oh, come over to the fire station, have a look." And I was almost fast-tracked into the retained service. Yeah. And I started doing the retains, and it was brilliant. I loved it. It was fantastic. What wasn't to like? We were going out quite a lot as a station. There was good camaraderie. It was doing something different. I was able to use the skills of, my mechanical brain, to put my hands to use.
Because so few people get that now as well. Those functional skills, like almost perfectly. You worked on a building site, and then you worked in a mechanics. You've got those hand-eye, those tactile, those dexterous skills. Really would serve you well coming into a service where you're a problem solver with things.
Yeah, it is an interesting one because the NFCC have just done a response to the white paper, and there is a question posed within the white paper around having a national standard of point of entry. And if we look at some of the other sectors like nursing and policing now, you've got to have a degree essentially.
Yeah.
And that's great. We want our staff to be, we want the job to be recognised for the level of intelligence and the level of...
It is a professional career, yeah. But you don't want to get elitist by asking for a degree.
No, and the issue for me is, and it's a genuine issue, is we still need people who can connect their hands to the brains,
yes.
And vice versa.
With the greatest respect to people that have degrees.
It is still a physical job.
100%, yeah.
And you've got to be able to be dexterous and be able to apply those physical skills. So...
Today's episode is supported by our good friends over at Duty Crew Coffee. Now, as you're probably aware, coffee is the most popular drink worldwide, with over 2.25 billion cups of coffee consumed every single day, and over 70 million of those in the UK alone. Most of this is consumed in our crew rooms, our watch offices, and by our emergency services frontline staff. So when you're getting together around the mess table, don't be drinking a nasty-ass cheap coffee. Nobody likes that guy that brings the cheap stuff. So if you head on over to dutycrew.co.uk or click the link in the podcast below, you'll be able to jump on over and see the Duty Crew coffee products. They come in 227 gram oversized high quality recyclable standard pouches, and they are individually wrapped 10 gram coffee bags. They're quick, mess free, convenient. They have a one-way degassing valve, which is an absolute must for storage of freshly roasted coffee. You can get the 20-pack response bag. They've got the HQ, they've got the No Duff, they've got the Unity, the Decaf, and of course all of their products are Rainforest Alliance certified, Fair Trade Foundation, and most importantly, they taste freaking epic. I started drinking Duty Crew about 2 months ago, and then when I fell in love with it, I got got in contact with them and they came on board with the podcast. So jump on over to Duty Crew Coffee if you want some of the good stuff. Now back to the podcast.
And we've got a lot of kinesthetic learners in the fire service as well. They're not always academics, bookworm, not saying that everyone needs to, but you know what I mean? It attracts a different person.
Of course it does. And it's interesting because if we look across the sector, and I asked the question a couple of years ago, why do we appear to have a lot more people who've, from what I can see, a high degree of people with dyslexia? And the answer come back to me when I asked some of our HR professionals and others. They said, well, think about the job. It's a job where you're applying dexterous skills. And actually, for those people who struggle because of issues such as dyslexia and other other conditions that make learning a little bit more difficult at times, they will go. It benefits the fact that in the fire service, all you have to do is pass the point of entry selection tests, which aren't necessarily easy, but it's a career where you don't have to apply your academic knowledge or do that academia all the time. So it does appeal to people in that respect. And yes, we want future leaders, but we still want firefighters as well.
And it allows people, like you say, from that learning style to feel a sense of success, because they may have struggled relentlessly through their entire schooling career, and it's the old phrase of, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll always feel stupid.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas if you put a fish in water and they go, oh, wait a minute, I can be rewarded for this. I can not. Yeah, you're right. I can actually do this sort of stuff. But you keep putting a paper or a screen in front of me, and I struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the key. I mean, I think that's one of the benefits of firefighting. But it's interesting. So I'll just give you a little bit more background about my career. And so I joined the retained at 18, and I was getting on really well. And I remember a divisional officer, as it was at the time, we call them group managers now, came down to the station, and they actually said to me, have you considered joining whole time? And it was 2 years into my on-call career and retained career. I was 20, and I went for the whole time, and I got selected for whole time.
First time?
Yes,
wow.
Yes. And at the time with Cornwall, we used to go away to Devon. And so I remember going to training school at Plimpton. And unfortunately, when I was at Plimpton, we were doing a lot of running and in fire boots. And and these were the old rubber boots.
They're not designed for running.
Well, this is
terrible.
This is the interesting thing. So I developed shin splints, which is extremely, extremely painful. And I was on this recruits course, and I couldn't run. And I ended up getting put on the sick, as it were, and then taken up to Derriford Hospital to have a look at what was wrong. And there was a physio out there, and she said, "Oh, the problem is you've got fallen arches. All you need is arch supports in your boots, and you'll be fine." I thought, resolved.
Great.
Anyway, next thing, I'm sent back to Cornwall Fire Brigade. I'm put in front of their medical officer, their doctor. I remember it vividly. And she said to me, she has flat feet. Now, we were different people, and I think it was a bit naive for her to compare herself to me, because she said, "Oh, I've got flat feet, and you'll struggle, you'll never be a firefighter." And that was it. That was her diagnosis. And I thought, well, this is a bit odd. So the next thing I remember, I'm in front of the Deputy Chief Fire Officer at the time, and basically he said, "You're unable to complete your recruits course, you're now dismissed, you're unemployed."
Wow.
And I was taken aback. There didn't seem to be any, but there was no back coursing, no back squad in those days, because I was told that somebody broke their little finger on the course, extending a ladder, and they got sacked on the course previously. Very harsh, very very strict regime. And I remember sitting there and thinking, "Oh God, what do I do now? I've got no job." So I'm still sat there in uniform. So I did what I did before. I drove to places like, my brother works in a garage in a place called Bodmin. I went to see them, had a chat with them, and managed to get a job offer. Drove back to my old employer, and just to pop in and say hello, got a job offer. So within the same day of getting sacked, I got 2 job offers. And I thought, okay, well, and I still had my desires to be a firefighter. So I thought, well, what was the best for me? So I went back to my old employer. It upset the first employer who'd offered me a job, which I did apologise.
Was there no way to challenge that decision then?
No.
There was no appeals process?
No, nothing. You said, the letter said, you unable to complete your recruits course, therefore you've got no employment rights at that time, you've got nothing, you are sacked.
Wow.
You're dismissed. And it was interesting. So I went back to speak to my colleagues at the retained fire station, and the guy I had spoken to who originally sort of got me in a brilliant guy. He was a sub-officer at the time, a guy called Peter Ashwin. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. Real salt of the earth, give you the shirt off his back type of character. Very brilliant bloke. Interestingly, academically, not very, what we would consider not very skilled. Yeah. Practically amazing. And he was one of those guys who I'd say had intelligence, but it was more of a kinetic intelligence rather than an academic intelligence. Really good guy.
They can see the way the world works, and they can see solutions to things.
Yeah, absolutely. And he actually, they had a visit from the DEP, and he turned round and said to the DEP, how much authority, how much clout have you got? And the DEP said, as much as I want. And he was there with the station, and they said, we want this guy back at our station. And to be fair, that put the wheels in motion, and I managed to get back into the retained, which was interesting because I've got the brigade doctor saying I'll never make a firefighter.
Hypocrisy is the best.
Well, yeah, and interesting. And to be fair, I remember some of the whole time staff actually kicking off a little bit about this at Bobbin Station. A guy called Bob Hoare, I remember him. I mean, he's long retired now. I don't know if he's still with us, but he was a good guy as well. And he actually said, well, there's a bit of hypocrisy here because firefighting's firefighting. But it worked in my favour that I got my retained job back, and I had to go and do all the tests and everything. I passed them all, which was bizarre. Anyway, I carried on retained for a while. And I remember even my grandparents saying I'd give up on this dream of being a a full-time firefighter. I'd just give up on it if I was you. It's not for you. And I remember people saying, I remember one guy in the town said, well, water finds its own level. In other words, you're not good enough. And I carried on doing the retains for a few years, and I'd saved up enough money in the meantime. And I remember myself and the girlfriend at the time did a trip to America, and we did it on a tight budget and everything, but we had this little driving trip around America, and I did a lot of contemplating. And I made up my mind that, no, it's what I want to do. And so when I come back, I spoke to another guy. He was a retired chief officer now. He was the ADO who supervised the station, a guy called Brian Tregunna, fantastic bloke. And he gave me the list, and this is the day before computers. He gave me the directory of all the fire services in the country. Nice. So I started phoning them all up, finding out who was recruiting. And there was quite a few. So I started applying to these brigades, and I went around. I applied to Royal Berkshire, I remember. There was Lancashire, Cambridgeshire, Hereford and Worcester, Dorset, and I started going through their processes. And I was honest with them. I told them my history about it, and they didn't seem that bothered. And the interesting thing, I'd gone through a lot of these processes, and Cambridgeshire was one of the last. But then I got a job offer first from them. And the irony was...
just filling out forms, but obviously it was no internet, no anything.
No, you had to fill in a form, you had to phone them up, and it was all done by post.
How many people do that these days? Some people can't be asked to go on the internet.
I know, it's really... And this is my point. If you want something, you have a choice. Yeah. You can do something about it.
It's never been so accessible as it is now.
And this is my... this is why I get a little bit frustrated when I see people who I feel want to be spoon-fed. Because... if you want something, you have to motivate yourself. And anyway, I got this job offer from Cambridgeshire, and then about 6 weeks later, a job offer arrived from Dorset, subject to medical, and it was interesting. I thought, well, a bird in the hand and all that, so I carried on with Cambridgeshire, and they knew all about my medical history. The irony was, I'd also applied for Cornwall again the whole time, passed all their tests, but they wrote back to me saying, no, you're not deemed fit enough to ever be a firefighter. Anyway, long story short, I moved up to Cambridgeshire and started there. I was a little bit nervous because I was first time living away from my home in terms of my hometown. And
that in itself is a big commitment. A lot of people don't do that. They wouldn't do that these days.
Yeah, I was 25 at the time, but it was all my network had disappeared. And I was like, okay. But the interesting motivating factor for me was that I'd had arch supports in my shoes during training. So I'd done things, and I thought, well... the motivation was there's no going back now because I can't go back and ask for a job back another time if it didn't work out. So I had to make it work. Yeah. And I did all that I could. And it was an interesting time. And we went to training school in the West Mids. It was a 15-week course back then, and it was good times.
15 weeks is great.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it was. I mean, there was marching and stuff, and there's an argument to say nowadays, are we paying for our recruits to be marched around, and is that not a waste of money? I don't know, because I think some of it builds that team spirit, that camaraderie.
It's not just the principle of marching; it's what it is, what it creates in the team, the mindset that
working
it develops.
as a cohesive unit.
Yes,
being
there's
all in
loads to be
step,
said for
literally.
100%.
Yeah, so I'm not adverse to that, but obviously budgets are tighter now, and it's about, we're living in a slightly different and a more complex world.
But isn't there argument there? Sorry to interrupt that. When you say there's budgets and stuff, there's also a very hidden cost to not developing that culture early.
Yeah.
Because if you don't get in there and develop that culture early, that lack of camaraderie, that lack of willingness to pull together can bleed into the rest of that person's career. So the cost long term could be colossal. I know it's hard to quantify, and it's easier just to look at a metric and go 12 weeks versus 15 weeks, pay this. But I don't subscribe to that as much. I do believe, and I don't know if marching is the answer. I'm sure it's not just the only answer, but I think we should have a better focus on the fact that we are building teams. We're not trying to build one competent individual. You are just one cog in this massive machine of operators, control staff, backroom, everything like this. We need you to work as a team. That is more important. The wider thing is more important than the individual, by far.
Yeah, and for me, I think there's a little bit of pride in it, self-pride. But
100%.
I mean, it's a difficult situation, and I don't think now's the time to delve into the complexities about why and why we don't do that anymore. So I moved to Cambridge for Fire and Rescue Service, and it was interesting. And the one thing that struck me is I remember going and working at Cambridge, and I'd done 7 years retained. I'd been a driver. I'd actually rescued another firefighter from drowning at an incident. I'd done CPR. I'd rescued people from burning buildings.
You rescued another firefighter drowning?
Yeah, we were on incidents with floods, and me and this other firefighter were tasked to go and check this property to make sure nobody was trapped in it. And this was quite a remote property. We were split up as a crew. There were 6 of us on the pump that day, so we went off in teams of 2. And we were walking across this flooded, large garden sort of park area. And you could see there was a whirlpool, so there was obviously a culvert. And we were doing the BA shuffle, I remember, and then suddenly my mate just disappeared. He went under. And I was like, oh my God. All I remember is managed to dive, and I actually landed on top of the lintel over the top of the culvert. And I remember putting my hand down, finding him. He'd got sucked in and just pulling, and his yellow helmet popped up. And he scrabbled out over the top of my back. And I was like,
mate.
That was a close call. And the irony was, we just went, oh, okay, we're both soaked because we've been underwater now, because I'd laid down. And we thought, right, we better go and carry on and check this property. And we just we were soaked through to the skin, and we just carried on. And we never thought anything of it. It was really bizarre. And that was it. And then we got back to the pump, and then they looked at us and said, yeah, we ought to head back and get you dried up and changed.
Isn't it crazy how things have changed, though, where we're so, I don't want to say fearful, but there's a big thing in the UK Fire and Rescue Service about entry into water now and boots low and all this sort of stuff. I'm not sure we're quite where we need to be yet, and I know there's masses of things at play within that, but I always worry that the public need a bit more than what we're doing sometimes. And that's only my personal view, but it's difficult. I know there were dangerous things we were doing back then, but also the frequency of people that probably got hurt was probably very low.
It's an interesting one, because our safe systems of work and procedures are born out of tragic events. That firefighter in Manchester who lost his life doing a water rescue, and other events, and the cold water entry. We probably understand it a bit more now, and we have to keep our people safe. And some of that keeping people safe is giving them the right training, the right education, but also the right kit and the right skills. So
that's we're restricted by finance, you know what I mean? We would want to train people up to be able to, probably in my own personal, I'd happily have all of our firefighters able to do this with water and blah, 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 blah. But financially, it's probably just not feasible. But then that frustrates me, because it still feels like the right thing to do. And I know that's the romantic, immature mindset, not fully understanding the costs involved, but I just...
It is an interesting conundrum, and as we know, we don't have a statutory duty to do water rescues, but we have a duty to make sure we assess and address all the risk in our area, which by default means
it's going to be us. We're going to show up.
Exactly, and it's a conundrum we're faced with. In an ideal world, we'd have loads of funding to support this, but we don't.
No.
But we still have a duty to go out and save savable life, and make sure the community is protected. So it's a complex it's a complex issue. You can almost say it's a wicked problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
But where, especially with some guidance that's come out lately from, the HSE and NFCC and such like, it is a very complex issue, and I think a lot of the complexities focus around the capacity and the financing to achieve it.
Yes.
But we've still got to achieve it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So
take me back to when you joined your first station and whole time. What were the big differences between your on-call experiences and whole time? What was the culture like?
I wasn't blind to the expectations of culture, and I knew that there was all the folklore and myths around. Oh, they'll probably pull some jokes on you.
Hazing,
And interestingly, fortunately, that never really happened when I joined Cambridgeshire. They were quite good at that. Because I remember going in, you put your kit on your peg before you join. You go and meet the watch, and then you'd have a few days before you joined the watch, as in your first shift. And I expected to find something in my boots or something, and there was nothing.
Your sleeves filled up with something.
and I'm glad to say there was nothing. But the one thing that did strike me was the culture, and I reflect back on it, and I think it's a bit of an odd culture. That, bearing in mind, the reason I mentioned, I'd driven fire engines, I'd even been in a fire engine that crashed and gone inside. I've got quite a wealth of experience here on call, and I joined the watch, and what they didn't like was somebody who'd only just joined the watch but knew stuff, and I quickly learned to actually just keep my mouth shut. And I remember them saying, "Oh, you picked that up quick." And I remember thinking, "Yeah, I've been doing it for 7 years, mate." And I'm not being. There wasn't an arrogance. It was more around, but can't you understand that I've got experience doing this? But it was almost like, "Oh no, you've just been born. You know nothing," which I thought was a really disappointed attitude.
Yeah, I'd also think though, and I see it with watches, where they like the idea of having a recruit because they like the idea of shaping somebody with the best values and practices that they believe on their watch, and that's the way that they do it. And if somebody already comes in with a fingerprint or 7 years of fingerprints on them, it kind of takes away their ability to do that. And that doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just an observation where people are... Because there's also... It makes you feel good when you teach somebody something. If somebody doesn't know anything and you're able to develop them. If somebody goes in and you're like, hey, let me show you this. And they're like, I know how to do that. And you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I know. It makes you feel a little bit...
Yeah.
And to be honest, I probably did say that a couple of times, which obviously upsets people. I quickly learnt to sort of just go with the flow. But the irony is, I remember looking back, and I remember some of the people teaching me stuff, and I knew it was wrong. And when I spoke to other people, they said, "Why have they taught you that?" And I just thought, do you know what? It's better. But it wasn't a bad time. I mean, Cambridge was a very busy station. I really enjoyed it, and it was a good experience. But I soon grew very frustrated. Not frustrated, probably bored of being a firefighter. In the
How
respect
soon
that,
would you feel that start to itch?
and I think, because I'd done 7 years on call, and I'd got a very broad and wide experience from that, I wanted more, and so I decided I'd already started studying for my leading firefighters exam, as it was, and I'm a sub officers, and eventually got my station officer's ticket in succession. So I expressed an interest to get promoted. So after just over 2 years being on the watch, I was still a probationer, I managed to secure a position as a leading firefighter on a different watch, which was interesting because by definition I didn't have to finish my probation. I just had to sign a bit off. So in my third year of probation, so just after 2 years, I was promoted to leading firefighter.
What was that dynamic like on the watch?
I had to move to a different watch. So I moved to Red Watch. It was interesting because... there was the perception of others. Well, what do you know? You've only been here 2 years, but that's where I think some, prior learning and knowledge was to my advantage but I think it was other people's naivety. But it was interesting because there was another leading firefighter on the watch who'd been there a while, and they saw it as competition, and there was a little bit of friction. And interestingly, another person I went training school with me joined the watch probably about 6 months later as a leading firefighter. So they'd done similar to what I'd done, and that person is now a chief fire officer in another brigade. And there was a dynamic there, wasn't the existing leading firefighter, because we had 3 leading firefighters, a sub officer and a station officer on the watch. If you like, the old sweat, in inverted commas, leading firefighter saw us as a threat, and that individual couldn't pass they they struggled to pass their sub-officers paper. They couldn't get it.
Yeah.
So they were seeing these young kids
whatever.
going past them. And I get that. It's very frustrating, isn't it? But to be fair,
it's a bit like standing at a door and you just can't get the kid. You're just struggling, and someone just swans through the door, and you're just like,
Yeah, and it was interesting. But this was all self-motivated. And anyway, I did the leading firefight bit for 2.5 years, I think it was, and it was great. And again, I grew quickly bored of that. As in, it wasn't. There's nothing wrong with being a leading firefighter or a firefighter. But for me, I just felt like, okay, I got a little bit of itchy feet. So I was able to apply to become a sub-officer, and I got temporary posting, and they moved me up to Peterborough. And I had an experience on a watch there, and they put me on a very militant watch. It was where the FBU secretary and
God,
and it was.
There's one of those watches where you try and make a decision, but everyone else looks at not necessarily the FBU, but the person who is the senior in there, and they're like, "Are we doing this or not?" Because you're actually in charge, even though the actual person in charge. And it was kind of a bit like that.
It was very much like that, and it was interesting because there was quite a few. There was a little bit of power-based struggles there in that respect.
How did you navigate that? Because I often think that you've got to recognise who I always call them sort of cultural architects are, who the power players are in teams. You've got to onboard them. Either you make them feel valuable, you make them acknowledge them, so the rest of the team, if you battle them, it's arduous.
This is an interesting thing, is because throughout my career, I've gone into places and positions, and there's been friction initially between me and someone else. But it's interesting. It's almost like it has to get better. It's get worse to get better. Yeah. And there's been friction, but then we've got over that friction and become really good, like colleagues, friends. And this was the irony. I had the same thing on that watch. So there was a little bit of banging heads, but then we cleared the air, and actually the relationship was really strong. Yeah. And I think it was
You've
about...
got to be able to keep leaning in though to get that, because some people just separate. I've had in my service where people in different leadership positions, stuff like that, when they first come in, and I felt myself jar against them. And my wife said something a long time ago, and she was like, "Yeah, but would you go to war with them? If you had to pick a team of people on your boat to go to war," and I'd be like, "Oh yeah, I'd want that person on my boat." So you actually are drawn to them as well.
Yeah, and I think it's about people's perception of power bases, and who's in charge, what you're eroding my power base, and that sort of thing. I think some people see it as a challenge to their status or their perceived status within an environment. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because what I've learned is it's about dynamics, about picking up on body language. It's about understanding actually how do I best pitch myself to get the best out of people. And it was so that's up to me on that watch was it was a baptism of fire. And I remember the senior divisional officer at the time said we did that on purpose. Then they gave me a stint of a really sort of easygoing watch as Huntingdon, which was nice, and it almost gave me both ends of the spectrum. And
sorry, were these offered to you, or were you told you would be moving places?
I was told.
I don't see us able to do as much of that these days. I know that we can in services, but I don't see people enacting that power. And I think it'd be very healthy for a lot of teams, a lot of watches, to be moved.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because everybody in the Fire and Rescue Service has it on their contract, don't they? That you'll work any duty system at any location at the behest of the chief officer.
How many times do you look at a watch where you're like, it'd be really good and healthy for all of their development to just throw them into the wind and scatter them across a few different places?
It would, but we also, as being a responsible employer, we need to consider the work-life balance, making sure that we accommodate people because as best we can. So there's a balance to be had there. Yeah. Ultimately, we've still got to deliver a fire and rescue service, and we still reserve the right that, I'm sorry, but we need to put you over there because that's where we need you. But if we can make life and their working life the best it can be for people, when there's an argument to say, why shouldn't we? So yeah, I take your point. It can be...
I just find people use that as an excuse sometimes to avoid uncomfortable conversations, where sometimes you see a team that's not quite working very well, the dynamic's not quite there, and you think that leader or whoever's in charge of that station just needs the conviction to go, you know what, or they need to be able to articulate it. Because some people are like, oh, well, give me a reason. And you're like, because the team ain't working very well. On what metric? Look, I'm in charge. I'm saying.
I think any discussion you have with people, any decision you make, it's not a case of just do it. It's a case of these are the reasons. Allow people to understand the rationale, the understanding of the decision making. Now, for my mind, it depends on what environment you're in. Now, if we're in an incident and we've got a very dynamic situation, there isn't the luxury of time to explain to people because of this.
Mm-hmm.
I just need you to go and do that sometimes. But ultimately, you can have that conversation after the event. In what I'd call the normal work environment, let's allow people to understand the reason. Now, they don't always have to agree with the reason, but at least there's the opportunity to understand the reason. And for me, that's quite important. If people can understand what you're asking them to do or why you're doing it, there's a greater chance that they'll accept it, whether they agree with it or not. For me, it's about...
They've got to understand the why behind it.
It's moving from a parent-child relationship to an adult-adult relationship, isn't it? It's about, we are all just people, we're all adults, and we should have the maturity to have those conversations, but also understand the reason why and accept some of the things we don't like, which almost comes back to that statement you made around difficult conversations.
So on that note, when you see first-time leaders, because I know formally and informally you mentor and coach different people, either in your profession or outside of it, what are some of the sort of big mistakes or common mistakes you see new leaders making when they move into those positions?
I think new leaders sometimes feel they have to do something because of their perception of their position in the organisation and position of power and authority. The one thing I've learned in leadership over the years, I don't have all the answers. And some of the best answers can come from anybody in the service. And just because I happen to be a senior leader doesn't mean to say that actually the newest recruit on the newest station or the newest recruit into our support side of the service doesn't have the best answer.
And I see more that will be the case as we are having people at different ages and different experiences come into the service. They've got a wealth of knowledge to bring with them.
I mean, my role isn't to make all the decisions in terms of come up with all the solutions. My job is create an environment where we as a collective come up with a solution. And my job is to empower and facilitate delivering the right answer. I can't do everything. What I need is really good people around me to help move the organisation forward, and that is absolutely my role. And
also to shoulder the responsibility when the decision is made. If a boulder comes falling down, it's your job to catch it first, not step aside and...
Oh, absolutely. You've got to stand up and be counted, stand front and centre. And I've had a couple of recent experiences where I've changed... I've changed the way we do things around here.
Okay.
And people have had some nervousness around, what happens if it goes wrong? Who's accountable? Now, in a fully mature and developed organisation, we should be able to have just a conversation and rely on the spoken word. But it's interesting, 2 teams have asked me to put it in writing to say that I've made the decision and I'll take the accountability if it goes wrong, because there's some risk associated with what the decisions I decided on.
But there's an underlying tone there of organisational mistrust as well, isn't there?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I was quite happy to give them it in writing, because I believe that if you're going to have the courage of your conviction, have the courage of your conviction. And the interesting thing is, I think that the best organisations thrive on trust.
100%.
And trust comes from integrity and credibility and doing what you say you're doing, and actually being able to stand up and be counted, and when things go wrong, say, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Mm-hmm. And trust me, I've made a lot of mistakes in my career. But I'd like to think that I've learnt from all of them.
And also raise your hand as soon as you know it's happened. You know,
yeah, absolutely.
Don't tell me about a problem after the point at which I can fix it.
Yeah, for my mind, I mean, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? I learned in my career that if you go into your line manager with a problem, provide a solution. It might not be the right solution, but provide a solution as well, because it also allows that line manager, that leader, to think, well, actually, this person's thought about the problem and they've got a solution. And a lot of what I find in my role now isn't about coming up with all the solutions, because I can't possibly know everything about the organisation. It's, look at the number of people in my directorate I'm responsible for. I can't know the intricacies of their job. I trust them to know their job and do it well. And what they're looking for me is, look, we've got this problem. It doesn't fit anything we've got existing, or we're not sure about it. Can I enact this solution because it achieves the right outcome? And a lot of the time I'll go, yeah, although I might stand back and go, oh, have you thought about this? What about the impact over here? What about the risk? Let's address those, and we go for it. But the good thing about people bringing solutions to problems, think about how empowering it is for individual, how that people are allowed to feel valued. And for me, that's the key thing. And I've said to a number of people in the organisation is, I won't take the monkey off your back, but I will help to get the monkey off your back, because that's my job. I can't be responsible for everything you need to do. Because for me, that's the spoon-feeding culture, which is not what I want. I want a very mature...
And you'll never develop that self-belief if I keep doing that as well.
Absolutely. And, if you give people a problem to solve and they solve it, and sometimes it's through trial and error, once they come out the other side, they'll know how to apply that learning to future problems of a similar nature. I mean, I've had a recent experience where I've used a template to do something I've always done. I've always had success in that, using the template in my mind. I won't go into the details of what it is, because some of it is confidential, but on this occasion it didn't go exactly right. And my reflection on it is, okay, the system I've used wasn't necessarily right for a couple of individuals. It was right for 7 or 8 others. So I thought to myself, well, what can I do different to make it better? And that's the key thing, isn't it? If what I'm doing isn't working, what do I do to make sure it works? And it's situational leadership. Over there it worked fine, over here it's not. So I need to apply a different method, a different way of achieving it. Sometimes you're not going to know that until you start with it, and that's where sometimes frictions can occur. Yeah. But the key thing is to pick up on those nuances around, I can read this is not going well, I need to change direction here slightly, or change tack, and make sure that I'm getting the best out of people. And that is very much what I feel my role is now. And it is certainly interesting that how we as an organisation develop and how people develop.
That gives me sort of a great jumping off point in terms of that neurodiversity or mental diversity. And I wanted to ask you around, because when I was listening to you talk about some of the challenges you'd faced in promotion and different watches and power dynamics, I was recently at Women in the Fire Service, and in fact, I know saw you there, in fact, and I cast my mind to how people who already feel like they, or in many cases they are, starting from a deficit in terms of self-belief, in terms of feeling included or feeling welcomed, how they would go about handling those situations. Do you think, we've been pushing 3 decades plus, probably trying to battle to create a more diverse and inclusive workforce. Do you think we're quite there yet? Are we doing enough? Do we need to do anything differently?
No, we're not where we need to be with an inclusive workforce, for sure. It's an interesting conundrum as well. I've got a colleague who's a deputy chief constable, and she's an amazing woman. She was really helpful to me. But I posed a conundrum about something I'm quite passionate about, and that's improving the number of women we've got in the fire and rescue service. And that's why you saw me down at the Women in the Fire Service annual conference there. But she pointed something out to me. She said, "You have to," and being a woman, this is quite empowering. What she said, and I've heard other women leaders in the fire service, or have been reported that other women leaders in the fire service have said similar things. And she said, you also have to understand that we've got 50% of the population typically are women, but it's still not going to appeal to everyone. So should we set our targets at 50% of the workforce, or should we be satisfied with a better target or better representation than what we've got, but it won't ever be 50%? And I did think about that, and it is interesting because in my previous service, and even in this service, I'm talking to a lot of women, trying to encourage them to think about joining the firefighting side of the organisation. And there's still a lot of go, it's not for me. Now, is that because there's a perception it's still a very physical job, and you have to have big muscles and be the macho firefighter, or is it actually it just doesn't appeal? It's an interesting thing, because I'm sure for every person it doesn't appeal to, there's plenty more it does appeal to. So the point is,
I speak to some physical trainers who work as PTs for services, and I often say to them, dude, you'd be great as a firefighter, and they just said, it's not for me. And that's a fit and healthy guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah,
it's not.
And that is the interesting thing, isn't it? Do we keep chasing the people who actually don't want to do it, or do we actually just make sure that those that do that it's accessible? And I think
remove
it's the
all the
latter.
barriers for those that want to.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also making sure that we are able to appeal to people who haven't considered it or may have considered it but weren't quite sure. And I think that's the key thing. There's a lot of factors, and it's a very complex conundrum that we're faced with. Because if it's easy to fix, we would have fixed it by now, wouldn't we?
Mm-hmm.
As a UK fire and rescue
It's not as though we haven't put enough resource and time and thought into it.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think I did see a comment around a response to government by the NFCC again that was said, or one of the brigades, it could have been one of the fire services, that said, we've been struggling with this issue around a more representative workforce for quite a long time, like 10 years or more. And I think the response came back, well, why didn't you fix it by now? But it's not as easy as that, is it?
No, I heard a great rebuttal to that, which was the nursing sector have tried to have more men in the sector for over 30 years, and they've had something like a 2% increase.
Yeah.
So, it's not just that simple much of a problem.
So let's just think about actually people's values, because there's an awful lot of society who have traditional values. Now, is that right or is it wrong? Who's to say? But there's the values. Society has changed. We've moved on, and we are more equal. We are more, as in terms of allowing people to do the job. Because I remember years ago, you go onto the stations and. Well, I remember that it wasn't that long ago. Actually, women weren't even allowed to apply to be firefighters, and the same in the military and such like.
Yeah.
And it is an intriguing situation. I don't have all the answers, but what I do have is the passion to make sure that we can do more to encourage more women to join, and that's something I want to carry on with.
Certainly feels like we are moving in the right direction. It may feel very slow to people, but I also say that because, again, as we referenced earlier in our conversation, we're doing so much recruitment now. I feel like the fruits of the labour of the last 10 years can be sown now, if that makes sense. Like, we could have tried really hard for a long time, but we weren't doing masses of recruitment during that period, whereas now we are doing masses. So don't stop now. Lean in more, or lean in just as much, because I feel like we're going to see that. And I know in the service I work for, and I think it's the same in yours, it's that we are seeing a lot more come through, I think, and that's just that's a finger in the air. I don't have any statistics to prove that. But.
No, we are seeing a lot more women apply to point of entry. We've still got some issues around people getting through the point of entry tests, and the interesting thing, I was doing a piece of work around fitness levels, and we have our levels of our standards to make the grade, as it were, to join the fire service, and it's interesting because biology plays a part here.
100%.
And women on average have to be fitter comparably to reach the same standard.
Yes.
And I've seen some statistics around once women get to a later stage of life, like the 40s and 50s, the way their fitness level translates is they've got to do even more effort. Now it's interesting because this is what I was speaking to the deputy chief constable of a police service about. Because it's something she's looking into, and it's something I'm very keen. And they've got the same problem, and especially with their firearms officers who have to reach the same standard as us. So it's something.
Do they have annual tests still? Do you know what their fitness tests regime are? They have
I can't speak for the police.
Because they used to have entry tests, and that was it.
Well, we did as a fire service.
We didn't do.
But there's this police force. It's the Ministry of Defence, and they're all their officers are armed. So therefore, their officers need to reach a fitness test, because part of being a firearms officer, you have to have a high level of fitness than regular. So, but their fitness level is the same as firefighters.
Okay.
So they're looking at the same issues, and that's something that I'm trying to do some work on to understand what can we do as a service, as a sector, to support that and ensure that actually people are still fit and able to carry out the job.
I mean, how old are you now?
Me, I'm 50.
So you're 50. You still seem to do something to keep yourself in shape. What habits have you utilised? Because with the greatest respect, sometimes the further back people come from the quote-unquote front line of operational services, that can fall by the wayside. It doesn't appear to have with you, and that's not me blowing smoke up you, but, why have you done that? Does it matter? Is it necessary? Why do some people don't?
I don't know. I do wonder how much genetics play a part as well, because my job is sedentary. I sit at a desk all day. And until recently, I was still commuting in from another county, and it was an hour and a half each way. So I was having 8-9 hours at a desk, plus 3 hours commute, sat down. And for me, the fitness is level. Now, I try and use the gym on our facilities in service 3 times a week. The last 3 weeks, I've got there once in the last 3 weeks because of pressures from work.
Yeah.
So I sort of regulate what I eat. It's interesting because you look at some of my colleagues, and they've got a similar job, and they're very lean and fit, and they don't do that much exercise. And I think there is a degree of genetics around it, I believe. But it's about actually just keeping an eye on what you eat, what you do. And trust me, I like a drink. I like my beer. And it's very difficult to balance. So what do? I basically just try and keep an eye on it. And I've just taken up, I've moved into the area, and I'm fortunate that I live in a lovely area now, and I'm able to do a cycling route that's 20 miles, and I'm pushing myself every weekend, apart from when I'm on duty, because I can't cycle 20 miles away from where I am, and to do that circuit once a week and get faster. So a little bit more cardiovascular around that. So yeah.
That's got to be so good for things like mindset as well. We've had, again, a real focus for my limited career. I've been in, 15, 16 years now. But certainly in the last 9 years, we've seen a lot more focus given to mental well-being and how we support all of our staff, frontline, backroom, all that sort of stuff. How do you see it? How have you seen it develop? How have you managed it yourself? And do you think we do enough?
Mental health and well-being is definitely being better supported. I think rightly so. I've had my own struggles. What people won't know is, and it's interesting, we talked about a diverse workforce, but not all diversity is visible. Now, I have a chronic health condition, and that chronic health condition actually means under the Equalities Act, I have a disability. And this is what people don't realise. And this disability I have, and it links to my fitness as well, because part of my fitness regime is protecting my body. And my disability means I'm in constant pain. I have to take a lot of drugs. I have to inject myself once a week with an injection. And I literally am in constant pain. And it's those levels of pain that vary. Sitting here right now, my back is killing me. And it affects... And part of my condition, it is known that it also gives you fatigue. And
having that much cortisol and pain in your body is stressful, and stress requires so much energy.
Oh yeah, I've had the old cortisone injections they give you, and they say you're only supposed to give you 3. I must have had about 15 in my knee. I've had major surgery to my shoulders and everything. My condition is getting worse, and I know that in older age I am going to be immobile, and I'm going to be in a lot of pain. There's no cure. It's a genetic condition I have, and I've thought, and that is partly linked to the shin splints I had earlier and everything else. And I was diagnosed with it when I was 30, and it was an interesting time because that was still in a time where actually, if you had a serious condition, I don't know if you recall, but years ago, even if you had things like hay fever or asthma, you couldn't be in the fire service.
Yeah,
and I was deeply worried I was going to lose my job. I kept it from the service for a while. And fortunately, there's things changed around disability, and I was able to come out and explain what I got. And it is interesting because every day is a painful day for me, and some days I'm in a lot of pain, and some days I'm in less pain. And I'm not saying it for a sympathy vote and everything else. It's a fact. I remember one officer once saying to me, senior officer, "Oh, you need to smile more." And I was in a bad day, and I remember thinking, the analogy, walk a mile in somebody else's shoes.
Yeah.
And the bit for me is you shouldn't judge people quickly. And
you've got no idea what's going on.
Exactly. And this comes back to mental health. But I've had some really, really dark days in my mental health.
Especially if someone said, like, at 30, this is only going to get worse.
Yeah. Oh, honestly, I didn't know where I was going to be. To be honest with you, I didn't think I was still going to be as fit as I am now at this age.
20 years down the line, yeah.
Yeah, and I've been taking drugs every day for 20 years since I was 30. And there's no chance of me coming off those drugs. And
But also, do they remain as effective? Because your body kind of...
well, that's the problem. As the
They keep
condition gets
changing them.
worse, and
Yeah.
I've just recently been to hospital, and they said, "Oh, we can change your medication." I don't want to take tablets. I don't want to inject myself. So I'm very reluctant to change medication. I mean, the interesting thing for me as a person, my pain threshold is quite high because you live with it, and that produces two things in me. It produces the fact that, okay, I'm resilient. That I've learned. I'm resilient in terms of my own mental health and well-being to a point. But I'm also resilient. My career path hasn't been gifted. I've had some big setbacks, and people don't realise this. I've had several periods in my career where I genuinely thought I was going to lose my job, and that plays on your mind. And then I was frustrated for a long time as a station manager. I couldn't progress, and there was all sorts of different dynamics. And at a time when your mental health and well-being isn't great, you've got a long-term condition, and trust me, it's not a place I would want anybody else to be. So in terms of mental health, it's something we should be more appreciative of and make sure that we understand people. There is some people saying, well, mental health is a new backache, and it's a difficult one. I mean, think of some of the things we've been to. I mean, I'm quite proud in my career. I think it's worth mentioning. I've actually done a live carry down at an incident.
Wow.
We got called out, and I'm really proud of that. That was one of the crowning moments in my career. But on the other end of the spectrum, I remember I've seen some horrific things, and they do play on your mind, and we forget this. How people get exposed to some horrific incidents, and I know people have gone off work with PTSD. And you think about it. It's not so. I remember ambulance staff saying to me, paramedics saying, "We couldn't do your job because you have to pick up the pieces." And I was thinking,
My
well, I can do their job.
Paramedic, and
Yeah.
he said, and we think about what a paramedic does, and they do a fantastic job. But he says, in a weird way, he said, "I'm kind of jealous because you guys go to a lot more trauma than we do." And I was like, "What do you mean?" It's a lot of what they go to is day-to-day, small, more minor issues, and they can spend hours and hours trying to book somebody in a hospital. Whereas when we do go, it's trauma. It's usually trauma straight away. We don't go to the achy bit and the this, the that. Yeah, we might go to assist people back into their bed and things like that, but we go to a lot more trauma than they do.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the ambulance tell me, if they can treat, they take and treat. Whereas if it's a fatality, and I've gone to fatalities where, as a lot of our colleagues have, you're literally picking up body parts, and
Can't tell how many people are there.
I mean, it's horrendous. And I've actually been to, because of the roles I did as a fire investigator and a hazmat and a DIM officer, which some of the fantastic roles, got some really good experiences from that. But I've got some really horrific ones. I remember going to a murder scene. I've been to a couple murder scenes, and it's not a place you want to go. We got, because there was a fire connection there, so we went as murders, as fire investigators, and some of that stuff. And I've been to accidents, industrial accidents, which is some of the worst. And some of the things are horrific. And
from an investigation perspective, some of the hardest to navigate because some people are very worried about the ramifications of that when it's an industrial accident as well.
Yeah, and so we didn't really investigate the industrial accidents. We went up there to deal with the fatality side of it.
Yeah.
But when you look at the consequences of the accident, and these are people getting caught in machinery and dragged under machines and things collapsing on them, it's not very nice at all. But it all plays a part. I mean,
I remember reading through the report. Remember that Hovis factory? Did you ever hear that one? Where they had a problem with the bread machine and they needed somebody to travel in on the conveyor belt to have a look at what was wrong with it. So there was just a local guy that did potholing, and they sent him in with the mechanic, but they had to wait for like 6 hours for the machine to cool, but they wanted to get it up and running again. So they left it for 4 hours and then went in, and they started traveling in on this conveyor belt, and it couldn't go backwards. And you could hear him and hear him and hear him. I've listened to some of the stuff with it and the investigation for it, and you just think, oh God. And I worry that with the pressures of industry now, post-COVID, and how we're all trying to survive, I hope mistakes like that don't get repeated. I went off on a tangent, sorry. But yeah, some of the industrial accidents can be horrific.
Yeah, they are. I mean, and that comes back to the whole talk, the conversation we had around water rescue, doesn't it? We've got to make sure we've got the right safe systems of work in place.
I wanted to cast your mind back for a second just about your experiences with On Call. because it's still a massive part of UK Fire and Rescue Service, and I think they do a wonderful job, but it's becoming very difficult to get people into it, sometimes because of the financial constraints in society and the fact that it's not massively financially rewarding. Do you see it continuing to... I spoke to Roy Wilshire before, and he said that he'd like to see it continue, but he's not really sure. How do you see it continuing? Do you think it's essential? Do you think it's good? How do we get people to do it?
It's an interesting duty system. I mean, I enjoyed my on-call experience.
I did it for 10 years. I loved it.
Oh, yeah. Like me,
But it doesn't pay very much, and I have a lot of time away from my children.
And then there's the competing demands. I mean... And part of the reason I decided to go for the whole time was also my employer. We'd slimmed down the workforce where I worked, and if I disappeared on a shout, 50% of his workshop staff went, and customers' cars were waiting.
Some people just can't have that now. If you're working in the shop, I'm just going to run off whenever. No, you can't.
And it's interesting because where I was on call in Cornwall, they had English China Clays, were a big employer. And they were a fantastic employer because they used to basically provide most of the fire service in Cornwall. And they were good. And they'd let people go off all day and all night and they wouldn't worry about it. But as these industries have become leaner and as they become, there's a need to, improve their profit margins because that's how they exist. They can't afford to let staff go. But I think there's another aspect to the on-call. In culture, society's changed. I mean, I was the head of on-call in my previous service. And having done the role and then managed the on-call section of the service, I'm fully aware. And you think about it. I mean, I remember in my previous service that we used to have some on-call stations in the south of the county that were affluent towns, and a lot of these people would commute into London. Yeah. Imagine this, you've been in London in a high-stress job all day long, to come home and then do a second job that doesn't pay anything, or relatively low.
You're trying to recruit people who are on 80 grand a year.
It doesn't appeal.
What?
And I think, you think back, when I was retained, it was... the phrase man and boy. You grew up in the village, you worked in the village, you lived in the village, you met your wife in the village, and so on. Yeah. And those 40-year on-call people aren't necessarily there anymore because people move out of the villages. I think societies, now there's more opportunity for people. We do more stuff at weekends and evenings. There's more of a social environment. Travel's easier.
Just had Rob Barber, the chief of Staffordshire, on, and he said that I think his average is like 4 years now, and he's saying he's not getting return on investment. The amount he's having to spend, because they've got 60%, I think, of their workforce is retained on call.
Yeah, and it's the same where I used to work. Majority of the service was on call.
And they're just not getting their money back. It sounds harsh, but it's a lot to onboard somebody.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I changed some of the duty systems where I used to work, and it stepped outside the grey book scheme and condition. And I was fortunate at the time that I managed to get the union on board. The dynamics are slightly different now, and I can understand why. They're trying to protect workers' rights, and we're trying to, whether there's a whole conversation about are they in the right place, are we in the right place, which is probably a bit deep to get into today.
It is, yeah.
But in terms of the on-call, it's not a model that is working as best it can at the moment.
No.
Most of the UK Fire and Rescue Service is struggling. What the answer is, I genuinely don't know. I think it is disappointing that we don't see incentives being allowed from central government, if I'm honest, around the same incentives they have for the reserved armed forces.
Yes.
Tax breaks,
yes.
Or national insurance breaks for employers.
Don't really recognise frontline workers in that kind of way as much. That really does bother me. A friend of mine, I travel to London with them regularly, and they have a rail card, and military get 50% off or something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well,
yeah,
that's not fair.
I mean, to be honest, we've already talked about the pay for on call is minimal. It's token compared to what some of these people run business. They do it because they want to make a difference. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing as well, a lot of on call do it, and I know this from experience of my own and experience of talking to people, is the reason a lot of our on call become on call is not because necessarily they just want to make a difference for the community, because they do, but they actually want to go out and do the job.
Yeah.
And thankfully, society's getting safer. Our call volumes are reduced. But that creates almost a dichotomy that people are staying around to go out on a fire call, but the fire call doesn't come. So they're restricting their life, giving this commitment, staying within 5 minutes of a fire station.
I used to have to go and drop my kids off my parents. It was like supervised. If I wanted to stay with my kids, I'd have to stay with them at my parents.
Yeah. So they're actually massively changing the dynamics of their lives to provide this service, which is fantastic, and I don't think we can praise them enough for that.
Yeah.
But they're not getting the rewards they want. And it's interesting because when in the service I used to work, one of the stations was actually its own service, and it was a volunteer service, and they get paid nothing. Their reward is going out on an appliance and doing what they do. It's still an attractive job in that respect. And when you can't do what you want to do or what you see as the role being, then you question, well, why am I doing this? And that's what we see. We see people voting with their feet and leaving. And I've had experiences. I remember one on-call individual we took on, and they lived just on the periphery of the 5 minutes, and they kept missing the pump. And they turned round to me and said, I've been in 6 months, I've not been on a shout. I'm sorry, I'm leaving.
Yeah.
I don't go out at weekends. I say to my girlfriends at the time, no, we can't go to the cinema in the next town. We can't do this, we can't do that. I'm curtailing my life for no reward.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting conundrum we find ourselves in. So what the model is going forwards, I don't know. I think there needs to be better incentives. I think there needs to be better.
I think what you said about government, and then I'll push it all over government, it's not a slopey shoulder thing, but I think that is not a low-hanging fruit, and I think there would be some public support for that, because people want to find ways to support their emergency services, I think.
Yeah.
So I optimistically think if we had unions on board, that might be a more appealing option.
Yeah, and it's an interesting conundrum, because I had a lot of interactions with the Fire Brigade Union and the Fire and Rescue Service Association, the FRSA, in my previous role. And I did actually pose the question about, okay, what can you do to help us?
Again, don't just bring me problems.
Yeah.
Come on, you're here together.
Yeah, because guess what? We're all stakeholders in making sure we can provide a really robust,
forgotten sometimes,
sustainable. And this isn't about bashing the unions, because unions serve a really good purpose in the workplace. I genuinely believe that.
You've got to remember, and this is my view, not yours. You've got to remember who you represent as well, though. Yeah. You are there to represent other people. You're not there for your own thoughts or beliefs.
I agree.
I don't want to digress into that. Sorry.
No, and I don't want to sort of get into political arguments, because I don't think it's the right time or place. But ultimately, the people that represent the workforce, the unions, are stakeholders in making sure we can sustain service as well.
We all want this to keep going,
so
right?
help us to help you. Was my message.
100%.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about moving around, because obviously you moved location to start with. You moved around stations. You then chose to move services into your current role. I think about people that sometimes stay in a role for a very long time, and I wonder if there's a correlation between that and how engaged they are in their role. What was it like moving for you, and how valuable do you think it is? Because it's a big world out there. I think if you stay one place doing one thing, it's like reading one page of a book. You don't really get the full breadth of it.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's all about comfort, I think. And you could argue is also about fear or a lack of confidence.
There's an aspect of that in there,
yeah. I mean, we've already spoke about when I bit the bullet and decided to move counties, and I was scared. I'll be honest, I was really, really worried. I didn't know where I was going to live. I didn't know anything, really. I just decided to jump in and sink or swim. And it turned out... But it reminded me of being... I've been in the service when I first started in the whole time, and the first watch move you do is the most scariest watch move. Once you've done it, you'll go... Wow, why didn't I do that first? It's almost feel the fear and do it anyway. Yeah. I'll tell you what I liken to. I remember doing with the school, we did an outdoor adventure thing, and I remember going abseiling. And I remember leaning back on this cliff edge, and the instructor, I said, no, keep the rope tight. He said, no, that's not what we do. And I was stuck there. And I was thinking, oh my God, what do I do? And I abseiled down the side of this cliff.
Yeah.
And I did it. I was scared. I was really, really scared to do it. Yeah. But once I'd done it, I ran back to the top and wanted to have another go. Yeah. And I liken it to like anything. Once you've done it once and realise actually it isn't that scary, then it doesn't. Doing it again isn't a problem.
Yeah.
And I get that. So there are people who want to serve their whole career on one watch, but I would say, does that really benefit you? Yeah, it keeps you in a comfort zone, and it might be great for you as an individual. I don't know, because it's not me.
I think it limits you as a professional, because every time I go to a new team, I don't forget everything from the old team.
No.
I learn all these new... Because you've spoken to me about experiences today that I have not experienced. Yeah. And I would not, if we worked together, I would benefit from them, because I'd have your perspectives as part of my dynamic, of the way I think. You don't get that if you stay with the same place all the time.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? Because how often do we learn from other stories, others' experience? And some of that learning you have to take a pinch of salt. But it makes me, when I go to an incident, I think, well, I know a colleague told me about this, so I'm looking out for that now. And for me, actually, I want our people to have the broadest and most range of experience and the open-mindedness. And I would argue staying on one watch for your whole career is not going to give you that.
No.
I think the best thing people do is move around, and it's interesting. That's why we also move our apprentices.
I think that's so valuable, the round robin system.
Yeah, the round robin system, because it gives you an understanding of what the bigger picture's like. And the interesting thing for me is, I know throughout my career, I've mentored and coached a lot of people, and I remember people coming to me and saying, "Oh, can you help me?" And I said, "Well, the first thing I do is say, come out off your watch and go into a support role." And the amount of people who've come off the watch and gone, "Oh my God, I didn't realise first how hard people in support roles work."
Gotcha.
I know an individual who's, he works for this service who I know very well. I remember them coming off the watch and saying to me, "Oh my God, I can't believe how hard the support side of the service works." Because I think there's a perception that, we all sit at headquarters or whatever building it is, listening to whale music and sitting on beanbags all day long. It isn't like that. It is the people around us, and this is the interesting thing for me. Let's not forget that the support side of the service, which majority of it is Green Book, they work tirelessly to do the best they can for this service. And without them, we wouldn't have a service. And so for me, it's about broadening your experiences. And actually, every experience can only, provide some education. It's that old analogy, isn't it? Or adage, every day's a school day.
Yeah.
And I'm learning every day, and it is. I like it. I enjoy it. I love it.
I admire our Green Book staff for the way that they connect their sense of reward as well, because, like you say, for frontline operators, they can see the tangible difference. They go somewhere, something bad's happening, they do something, they make it better. It would be harder for me, and I'm doing a role currently where I'm non-operational, and it's harder for me to see the difference between what I do sometimes and the output and the actual difference that it makes. But when I speak to Green Book staff, they've got a really tangible link, and they get that from interacting. That's why I think there's lots of value from frontline staff coming back and forth and working off station and interacting more and not having siloed working, because they make those connections with people in the back room, and they're tremendous people, because a lot of these people as well are really qualified and really well skilled in their own sector, like IT, accounts, HR, whatever it might be. They are the experts there, and you can benefit so much from developing relationships with them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the bit that always jumps out to me is recently here, I remember there was a person who come off the watch and they were a bit nervous about it. And then when they realised they had to go back to the watch, they thought, "I don't want to." And fortunately, they've secured promotion and now they're a station manager. And it's great, because the experience for them was the same as what I've seen for so many people is, actually, I don't want to go back to the watch because I realise we can make a difference in a different role. And it is interesting, because I get a lot of satisfaction about, I'm only temporary in my role at the moment, and I'm hoping to secure the role full time. But either way, even going back to my old role, old role as an area manager, I get great satisfaction from actually changing the service and driving the service forward from doing the work I do. In fact, it's interesting, because I remember being a firefighter on the watch and listening to the people in fire protection going, "Well, we save lives in a different way." And being a firefighter on the watch, I was like, "Of course you do.
Behave yourself."
Yeah, but now I understand we absolutely do.
Oh, yeah. They save far more lives through the preventative action than we will by the snatching somebody out of a building once in a 1,000 days.
And it's not the glory as in going out in the trucks, and that is still quite a reward. It's quite quite thrilling, isn't it? It's quite,
love it.
To go out on blues and twos and do the job is brilliant. You're going out to make somebody's life better. Somebody's in trouble and we're going to help them. But equally, we do as much of that in the background. And for me, I come to work, and my colleagues do here in the senior management team. We work tirelessly trying to ensure that actually we're making the service better for the people in it and our communities. It does make. I do think sometimes that some people think we sit here as a Bond villain stroking a cat, trying to make their lives difficult. It couldn't be further from the truth. We are working tirelessly, trying to make their lives better with the limited resources we got, satisfying all the requirements of audits and inspections and political direction, budget cuts, and all that brings with it, to make sure that actually our firefighters and our people on the front line, our community educators, have got the best tools, the best equipment, the best conditions and the best facilities to go out and do the best they can for the community. And that's really important to me.
You've referenced there a few times different individuals who you've benefited from in the past, individuals that you've worked with and perhaps that you are helping guide in formal or informal ways. You see through fire standards and FCC and through a lot of the leadership development tools that are in the UK Fire and Rescue Service, this aspect we're looking more at again of mentoring and coaching and stuff like that. Could you give us a bit of a holistic view of what mentoring or coaching even is for people? Does it have to be a formal thing, and how you found it beneficial?
What mentoring and coaching is, they're distinctly different. Mentoring is, this is how you do it this way, essentially. I'll give you an example. Putting up a ladder and being shown how to do it is in its purest sense, is, you say it's instruction, but that's actually mentoring, or have you do it this way and this is the best way you get results. Whereas coaching is about, okay, what could you possibly do? Coaching is about getting the best out of people to think for themselves and think about solutions. Give them a little bit of support here and there. And I think, the purest coaches will never give you a solution. A lot of my experience through coaching is a mix of coaching and mentoring. People do run out of solutions sometimes. They do need a little bit of steer in a direction. I can remember somebody saying to me, who was coaching me, and it was the assistant chief at the time, he said, not the coaching me, I was talking about the assistant chief, and what would the assistant chief do? And I said, I don't know. And they kept asking the question, and I said, look, I really don't know.
Yeah.
And that's where you need the bit of, the mentoring bits comes in. But in terms of coaching, does it have to be a formal? I think, no, absolutely not. I've been coached informally and indirectly, if you like, by people who a firefighter, Pete, you and I can have a conversation. And what you don't realise is some of those conversations we had is a form of coaching, because it's starting to get me thinking. It's starting to get me thinking about, okay, have I thought about this? What can I do? So coaching can be formal and it can be informal. And anybody, and again with mentoring, to be fair, it doesn't have to be formal, it can be informal. It can be anybody. It's learn from every experience. I do feel that in our service and in other services of work, there is almost a culture of, well, I need a formal course.
That's the problem, yeah. People need it to be formal and almost guided, and it's that spoon-fed thing again.
Yeah.
We're like, that wouldn't work, because everybody is unique as well, so we can't sheep dip everybody with the same type of mentoring, because we can't have the irony of talking about diversity and all this and then I always say treat everybody fairly, but don't treat them the same.
Exactly.
Because they're not the same.
We all learn in different ways. It's interesting, isn't it? Because what does a course give you? A course gives you some foundation knowledge, and it may give you some understanding. You could argue some courses might even give you skills. I don't know. If they're practical, you can argue that. But you could read a book on brain surgery as a course, but I wouldn't let anybody loose on...
not for the first time.
No, you wouldn't want me to suddenly open up your head and have a go.
Yeah, I've read the book, though. I've read it.
Yeah, but I know that. And the point is, so, there is a experiential learning. Some things, there's that analogy FOFO training. Go somewhere off and find out. And that's great. But I remember down at the Fire Service College when I was doing my hazmat course and the qualifications, and the guy down there was very good. He said, with hazmats, you can't do the FOFO training because chances are you'll kill yourself. And
probably was something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So some things need courses and some things don't.
Again, your analogy of ladder climbing.
Yeah.
You don't want to just go up there and wing it.
No.
I'm going to give you let's talk about it on the ground first.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like anything. So in terms of coaching and mentoring, I think I've had some very good coaches over the years. I've had external coaches, I've had internal coaches. I think we do probably struggle with internal coaching because I think there is a little bit of within our nature, the way we've, product our environments, our default is, no, don't do it like that, do it like this. And that doesn't always work. And actually the best way to do it is let people develop their own method, especially when dealing with people. We're all different, aren't we? And the way I approach a problem will be different to the way you approach a problem. but we could both still get the same outcome. And it's all about the outcome. It's not necessarily the journey, it's the outcome. Sometimes if you're on that journey, we might need to just guide people back onto the right path, but it's about the journey. So coaching, I think, is important, and it doesn't have to be a formal, it doesn't have to be anybody, it doesn't have to be a senior manager. In my old service, we were quite progressive in terms of providing coaching. And what I used to see was the managers who had been successful, a load of group managers. There was a colleague of mine, he was a successful group manager. Everybody wanted to be coached by that person because you've been successful, therefore sprinkle some of your fairy dust on me. That isn't what's the right thing to do. So a coach is the best person for you. And I remember there was a firefighter in my previous service who used to go on and do almost like TED Talks on his days off. And not many people know it. And I mean, that's the whole thing. That person could have done better coaching than the chief fire officer.
Yeah.
But we tend to.
No, you're a firefighter though. You can't do that.
Yeah, exactly. but not from my perspective. But I think a lot of people. Well, if the chief's coaching me and mentoring me, that's got to be the best there is. No, not necessarily, because that person might not be the best for you. Mm-hmm. And I've had coaching contracts with people where actually it's not been the right people, it's not been the right thing, and we stopped it and said maybe you need to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And I've had other coaching arrangements where I've really helped people, and so there's no one size fits all. Mm-hmm. But coaching is important because it does help get the best out of people. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're a coachee, you're being coached, the first thing to do is have an open mind and realise that actually, there is another way, and maybe the way I've always thought about it isn't the right way.
You've got to engage in the process.
Yeah,
if you think it's going to fail, it will.
It was interesting because I went through a rough time in my previous service, and it was a real rough time. And I had this situation where it was quite a serious situation. It was involved a discipline case. I'd been in an incident and it had gone wrong, and we were going through formal process, and I thought my career was going to end. And it wasn't until, I had a mindset, I'd done everything right, and I thought, why is this happening to me? Look, it can't be happening, you're all wrong. And I become entrenched in my view. And it wasn't until my friend, this successful group manager as it happens, who's unfortunately no longer with us, he was a really good friend of mine. And he said, and the best friends were the friends who will tell you the truth as well, even if you don't want to hear it. And he said to me, stop and think. Look at it from a different perspective. And I won't go into the details, but the perspective he made me look at it is think, okay, and it comes back to that. I might not agree with it, but I understand it.
Yeah.
And once I understood it, I was able to take a whole different mindset to it, a different approach. I was able to rationalise it in my head, and I was able to then respond in the right way. And the long story short
without too much loaded emotion.
Yeah, the long story short is it still wasn't comfortable, but I didn't lose my job like I thought I was going to lose my job. And the interesting thing about that...
You engaged in the process rather than fighting it. Or...
Exactly, but understanding it. The interesting thing was as well, it didn't do me any harm. It did me a great benefit, that experience. Now, that sounds a bit perverse, as in, my God, you were in a discipline. I've been fortunate enough to been sat in every seat in a discipline hearing, and it gives you immense knowledge. I've been the accused, I've been the representing, and I've been the hearing manager. And it gives me a wealth of experience. And when people say to me, well, you don't know what it's like, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
And this is what I said earlier. I've had several periods of my career where I thought I was going to lose my job. And it wasn't because I'm a bad person. It's just circumstances, situations. And I was able to learn from this experience, and it helped me go through that change curve. And that's important. And I've done some talks to people in the fire service around my experience. And the one thing, and this comes back to a bit of personal resilience and mental health and well-being, this is one of those points where I was not in a good place. And I was able to go through this process, go through the change curve and come out the other side, and literally 6 months later, I got temporary promotion. So there's also an indication here that actually, just because you go through something isn't a barrier to your progression. And that promotion then ended, and so on. And it took me a long time after to get a substantive promotion for all sorts of reasons. But in terms of mental health and well-being, I remember, and the analogy I used to use is, you've seen those films, haven't you, where all of a sudden I was accused of negligence in my role. And in my mind's eye, you stood out in an Arctic wasteland and you're there on your own. All my so-called or people who thought was supportive colleagues and friends had done a stand from under. They'd run away.
Wow.
Apart from this one person. And this one person, he stuck by me, and he's the one who told me the truth. And the good thing about it was, he told me the truth I didn't want to hear. But once I'd heard it, I was in a better place. And this comes down to those honest conversations. And my advice to anyone who's thinking about, okay, how do you become more resilient? How do you look after your mental health and well-being? What you need is a good support network. And what you need sometimes is people to tell you to be honest. Now, and that honesty may come at from a position of discomfort.
Often does.
Yeah, and I pride myself on I am totally honest.
How do you do that, especially then because sometimes if you don't have those great people around you just as colleagues or friends, that eventual truth sometimes not has or should or often has to then come from like a line manager, and a lot of people do avoid those truthful, challenging conversations. What advice do you give to people to try and do that? How do you navigate those conversations?
I mean, the interesting thing is, I think a lot of people do it because of they don't want to be seen as a bad person. They don't want to upset people. They don't want to deliver that bad message. There's fear of repercussion or not being liked. And for me, the best way to deliver an uncomfortable message is to actually get your facts right first. Know exactly what the facts are right. And then you have to be very, very considered in how you approach it. Now, if you work with the people, you should know how they're going to respond to stuff and how they're going to react. And it's about making sure you choose the right words, but also making sure that person's supported. Now, if I had to deliver you an uncomfortable message to you, I would approach it from a position of honesty and saying, and I'll probably prefix it with, I need to talk to you about something. It may be uncomfortable, but just bear with me, and do checks and balances and check back and making sure they understand what the message is delivering. Now, having been a recipient, depends on your level of emotionality and how you react to things. You're going to go through that fight or flight, fight or freeze situation. Some people will come out fighting and get angry. Some people will freeze and it'll be shocked, and some people just want to run away. But that shouldn't stop us delivering those difficult messages. And it's actually about that honesty and integrity. And I think this comes from a bit of maturity as well. And it's easy to say maturity, but how do you get there? Well, the only way you get there is by doing it. And the maturity for me was people had that honest conversation, and I was able to step back and think about, okay, what does this look and feel like? So I think for both the deliverer of the message and the recipient, there's a trick I've learnt through doing NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, was the third person. Imagine yourself now looking on at the conversation. You and I are sat at a table, so what I would do is, in my mind's eye, put myself over there on the other side of the room, or looking through the window from outside, and I'll be looking at the body language we've got, be looking about, listening to my tone, my tempo, the how I articulate myself, how my voice comes across, and all of these little nuances. They can help, but ultimately it comes back to you've got to have those uncomfortable conversations because it's the right thing to do. And they're only uncomfortable, I think, because of people are fearful of the reaction.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because even going back to that experience I had crews making comments and quips about it, and I remember thinking, but you don't know. There was a reputation, and I remember thinking, no, what you don't realise is because I, at the time, at this incident, wasn't robust enough in challenging people, having those uncomfortable conversations, putting those checks and balances in, I ended up in a position where I was going through discipline. I never took over at the incident. I put my trust in other people.
So you let certain behaviours or decisions just go too far.
Yeah, and I think
past the point where you felt I should have stepped in here.
Yeah, and there's a bit of check back. And this is what I learned, and it's interesting because I was in the Fire Brigade Union at the time, and I remember the union reps saying to me, "Do you know what? Next time," and they were watch managers, and they said, "Next time a station manager asks me and checks back, I won't be defensive about it." Because I've been to incidents when I've said to People are, right, I'm coming home to take over. What are you doing? And what are you doing that for? Right, okay, can you carry on and check back? And they look at you almost going like, well, I know how to do my job. No, this isn't about not saying
take
you know how to do
your
your
ego
job.
out of it.
This is about, take the ego out of this. This is about making sure actually I'm sure that you're doing your job right.
I'm on your team.
Because there are consequences if it goes wrong.
Yes.
And let's make sure that we deal with those consequences before they become a problem.
I'm here to support you. I'm here to potentially, not definitely, but add a greater wealth of knowledge. Maybe I know something you don't know. Tell me what you're doing. Tell me your thought process. Maybe I can help.
Yeah.
I'm not here to embarrass you. We're on the same team.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and that's it. I mean, it is difficult for difficult messages, and I think it is a fear of upsetting people, and there's a bit of personal resilience around the people delivering the message. I used to quite often get asked to deliver uncomfortable messages in my last service and go and suspend people and all stuff because they knew that I was capable of doing it. And every time I did it, I still got that little bit of trepidation inside, that little bit of anxiety before I did it. But then I used some of the skills and techniques I learned, and you can't go and tell people untruths. In other words, you can't promise them things when you're giving an uncomfortable message because you feel that's what they want to hear. Yeah. I
imagine that's a big frustration of people in HR when they're like, we've also got to do it properly. Do you know what I mean? Do it properly. Don't leave too much vagueness for, because then that lets us down in the long term. If behaviours don't change and if things don't improve, then there's like, well, you as the manager, you didn't do this properly from the start. You need to remember what you have a responsibility for as well.
Yeah. And
let them know where this may go. I don't want it to go there.
No.
But I'm just making you aware that this may result in X, Y, Z.
Yeah, let's be clear on the consequences. Yeah. And why do we do all of this? It's not to be hard on people. It's actually to get the best out of people and make sure that the organisation's performing, because ultimately we're there for society, aren't we?
What do you think's been your most proudest part of your career so far?
It's interesting that the proudest part, I don't think there's any one thing I can say is the proudest part.
I mean, from a low level, that incident with the individual pulling him out of the water and that carry down. I mean, so many things you've mentioned today, but
the carry down was really. I'll just touch on that. Is that I was stationed off the Ryder at Cambridge. We got tipped out to a location, and I knew it was a 3-storey townhouse. So I asked for the turntable ladder to be mobilised. We're driving down this road, short distance from the station. As we rocked up, there's a person hanging out the first floor front of the property window. Stationed off the Ryder, 2 pump attendants said to the crew manager, you deal with the front, I'm going to go around the back, do the 360. Round the back, 3rd-storey dormer window, mother and 3 kids screaming, help, help, black smoke billowing out the house.
Wow.
Ran round the front of the building, grabbed 2 firefighters, said, get the 9 metre off, get round the back, and they just took, we do a 3-person 9 metre.
Yeah.
No. And literally, they had BA sets dangling and everything. I weighed it up and thought, well, I'm the officer in charge, but we've got to act. And literally, as the ladder's going up, as it's getting extended and it hits the building, I'm running up the ladder.
Foot ladder, I'm gone.
And I guarantee you, I'm not over-egging this. I'm not glorifying. This is how it happened. And the ladder, it was on a dormer window, and there was a gap between the bottom of the window, and you got the slope of the roof. Yeah. And I couldn't reach. And I said to the mother, slide me the baby. And I thought the baby was 6 months old. Turns out it was 6 weeks old. And she slid this baby, and I reached out and grabbed it. And interestingly enough, I grabbed it, and I remember coming down the ladder. I ran around the front. The ambulance was pulling up. The ambulance driver saw me with the baby. He skidded to a stop, handed the baby over. We went around the back because we have to carry on. This was happening like bang, bang, bang.
Yeah.
As I'd done that, another one of the crew had gone up because one of the children had got out on the roof and was about to drop off the edge. He'd grabbed that. I'd ripped all the muscles in my back, and I was in agony. And it was one of those rapid decisions. But the interesting thing for me is I had sleepless nights over it. It really upset me. It really upset me. I was thinking, what happens if I'd missed? And that kept playing through my mind. What would have happened if I hadn't grabbed that child, if it had missed and gone? Yeah. And it was terrible. In fact, it's only because I think we all sit there and think, oh yeah, you rescued someone, they're not glorious and all this, I should get, let's go back for tea and medals. It was traumatic. It caused me a lot of angst and a lot of anguish in my mind. What had happened if I got it wrong? I didn't, but it was so close to getting it wrong. And But it was really interesting. And I think the disappointing thing for the watch was the watch took great pride in it. So there's 2 of us on the watch that night. I did a live countdown, which do not happen really in the fire service.
No.
And I think the disappointment for us, it wasn't recognised. Nobody actually come up and said, do you know what, you've done your job and you've done it well from the senior managers, which is, for me, something I've learned. So when I realised crews had done something, let's go and say thank you. And yes, you're just doing your job, but still, it's nice.
It does
to know.
matter. Yeah, it does matter. Yeah.
So it was good. I mean, and that goes back. So that was one of the highlights of my career. But from what I said, it was also disappointing. But in terms of what was the highlight of my career is, do you know what? When I look back, I've had a really wide and varied career. Because I was a DIM officer, I went to the hijacking of the Sri Lankan airliner by the Tamil Tigers at Stansted Airport. Didn't actually do stuff and was on standby. But you go to incidents like that, and I've been to a lot of police incidents in support of the police and stuff like that. And I was organising the Olympic Torch Relay, the blue light convoy for myself and Essex. I did a lot of the organising. I mean, Essex officers did it, but we had the DIM vehicle, so it's a joint approach. And I touched on Suffolk and Norfolk because they didn't have it. I did the arranging for that and followed the Olympic torch relay around most of East Anglia. Never actually saw it, but which was bizarre. But there was some stuff like that, and it was brilliant. And
that's
the networks.
what I mean, though. I think people don't realise how much they can get from a career in fire. They would never think you could do something like that. And the stuff I've done with International Search and Rescue, and just so many different places and ways and directions that you can do. And I don't think we articulate that very well. It's hard. We're not communicating very well. That's why we're not marketing ourselves very well sometimes.
Well, the fire service doesn't have as much diversification in terms of strands of job as other sectors like police or the military.
Yeah.
But there's still some good stuff.
It is what you make of it.
Yeah,
as well.
And I was fortunate enough to be seconded into Cambridgeshire Police for a period as well.
Wow.
That was an amazing experience. That's where I met the person who's now the Deputy Chief Constable of the Ministry of Defence.
Yeah.
And she was an amazing leader. But interesting dynamics when you understand their culture and understand how others operate. At the same time, I was also doing a role within Peterborough City Council as a senior manager, station manager, but they classed me as a senior manager. Really bizarre set of circumstances. All of a sudden, I've been dropped into this environment where I don't know actually what they do, and I've got no real authority. I had authority by proxy, but I was still employed as a station manager, just doing this role. But you couldn't go and give somebody an order. You had to motivate people through leadership skills, and I learned an awful lot. I learned how to bring people with me. I learned that actually sometimes having humility and listening to other people can be a powerful tool. So for me, in terms of what was the best in my career, all of it, and I've talked to some highs and lows. I've had periods where I lost my job. I was told I'd never be a firefighter. And I look back on that and think, well, do you know what? I've proved you wrong. And it's not about getting back at people. It's just
But that can be a pouful motivator.
Yeah, but it's to tax it. I mean, one of the worst things you can say to me is you can't do it. Yeah. Because okay. Although as I'm getting older and more mature, sometimes I think, some things in life. Somebody said,
"Is the juice worth the squeeze?" Yeah. Sometimes you don't just try and do
some
it
things I think
wrong.
I don't need to prove. It's not like
I'm in that phase now when people talk about physical things and they're like, "Yeah, you probably are stronger than me. It's fine.
Yeah,
I don't need to prove anything. I'm okay."
But it's interesting, isn't it? It's that old analogy. The older you get, the wiser you get, and to a certain degree, there is a lot of learning there. So for me, I've had highs and lows. I lost my job. I thought I was going to lose my job through sickness and health. Remember what I said about being afraid to tell the service I've got my condition. I went through discipline, thought I was going to lose my job. And so I've had some lows and I've had some highs as well, and I've had some great highs in the service about, and I've been recognised as performing well. I've got, respect from other organisations and, but the biggest high I get, to be honest, is when somebody comes and says thank you. I was pleased the other day, I gave a delivery just before our HMIC inspection to our middle managers. And I went in there and I delivered a bit of a motivational talk. And it was interesting because I thought to myself, how did that go? I had more than 4 people seek me out afterwards and go, do you know, that was brilliant. And do you know what? That made me feel so good. And I didn't do it for that. I did it because I wanted our staff to feel good.
Yeah.
But the fact is they sought me out and said, do you know what? That's just what we needed.
100%.
What's better than that? letting your staff thrive, and the people in this organisation. And to my mind, it's great that we can, have I made a difference? I think I have, and that's what's good for me. Am I replaceable? Yeah, of course I am. It's like everyone in the fire service. It's like that, putting your hand in the bucket.
We're just custodians.
Yeah. Once I've gone, people won't remember me. But I know that I've done the best I can do. Yeah. I've still got a ways to go.
You have. I'll say you're only 50. What's something we're looking
not just
at?
That, I've got a lot of learning
65.
to do as well. I'm still getting things wrong on a daily basis. But it's about learning from it all, applying yourself, and going, okay. And my advice to anybody is get knocked back, get up, dust yourself down, and go again. Because if you want it, you can get it. Now, it might take longer. It took me 12 years to go from station manager to group manager. It was frustrating. But you know what? Out of all of that, it's really interesting, because I probably learnt more about leadership myself and others by those failures than I probably would have done getting it first time. Failures can be a great educator. They're not failures, are they? They're learning experiences.
I would say they're a comma, not a full stop.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. They're a comma. Okay, what do I know about it? It's thing. If you get it first time, did you get it through luck, or did you get it because you can really do it?
Yeah, you don't really learn anything from
people
success.
say there is no such thing as luck. No, I think there's certain circumstances, right time, right place. That's luck. That is luck in a way that's outside of your control. You might be the only person who goes for a job on that time, and you might.
But you also had to have the conviction to go for it.
Yeah.
You can make yourself lucky because you have a lot of lucky conversations. And I put myself in front of people who could all say go away, who could all say I'm not bothered, who could all say no, but it just so happens you get more luck because you put yourself in that position to get there.
Yeah, but there'll be people listening to this thinking, well, what does that mean? It isn't about sticking yourself in front of senior manager going, look at me. Actually, just go to work and do a good job. But when you have that conversation, remember, it's the elevator conversation. I remember a colleague of mine, he's now the chief of Essex, Rick Hilton, really good guy. He once told me, he was the assistant chief in Cambridgeshire for a while, and he went to meet one of the watchers, and I won't say which watcher, it doesn't matter. And he relayed the conversation to me that he was passing the watch, and so they had like 2 minutes of his time. And he said it was an elevator conversation, as in they could have had an opportunity to talk about something really potential, but they were talking about something that wasn't really relevant. And this isn't about saying the what's wrong, but please take it in the right context. I mean this. They were talking niff-naff and trivia, where it was a missed opportunity to say, do you know what, we got somebody we can influence in the service. Yeah. What is the one thing I'd want to say to him if I've only got 30 seconds?
Yeah.
And that's my advice to people. If you think about, okay, if I want to progress, develop, and think about things, and I've got some questions that need to be answered, what is the question you want to ask if it's the only question you can ask? And that, to me, is the elevator conversation. And don't be afraid to ask it. Yeah. Because actually you might inspire some thought, you might trigger some processes, you might get people think, blimey. And it isn't about, waving the flag, look at me, aren't I good, I'm the best I am because I've asked you a good question. It's about actually thinking about your own development, because that'll put you in a good position to think about, okay, how do I approach situations? Do I deal with the stuff around the edges, the niff-naff and trivia, or do I go and deal with the actual real crux of the matter? And it comes back to that honest conversation, isn't it?
I think there's so much of that in life as well. If you don't think you're getting the right answers from life or the right answers from people, learning how to really ask a better question, because your mind is solution based. If you ask it a stupid question, like, why can't I get this? Because you're rubbish, Carl. Because you failed, Pete. Because you're not good enough. Ask better questions of people and of life, and you'll get better answers.
Yeah, and there is a bit about it. We're all wired differently, aren't we? And some of us don't need praise, and some of us do. And so you could ask better questions by all means, but I think there's also and I do it to a lot of people. I even do it to my peers and say, do you know what, that was really good. Yeah. I always believe in credit where credit's due. And that's not a bad thing. And I've given some feedback to the people I lead and manage, and I've said, you need to polish these areas, but you know what, you're bloody good. Yeah. And let's not forget that. And we don't do enough of that in this service. It's almost like, I think because we're problem solvers, we try and find a problem to solve sometimes. And I've seen it throughout my career in different services, that The fire service is very good at picking up on what we need to do better, and sometimes at the cost of, but we do this really well.
Yeah.
And that comes at an organisational and an individual level. So, you know, it's a great place to work. There's great people, and the one thing in this current service I'm in is that the people are fantastic. They genuinely are, and I've said it so many times, and it's not just me saying it. And I went out to one of our stations the other night, and I met the on-call watch, and there's 22 of them. Only half of them were there that night. And it's one of the on-call areas of the service that is doing really well. So I give them the thanks and gratitude for that, knowing all the problems we talked about.
Yeah.
But we struck up such a good rapport, and I come away from there feeling so good.
It's good.
And,
but
it's all about the people, isn't it?
Yeah. I always say, mate, I always used to think people were attracted to this because of the badge or the thing. They're not. We get attracted to this because of the incredible people that are in it. And the more we have incredible people in it, the more it's a better place to work.
I mean, don't get me wrong, they did talk about the badge. It's an identity. And that's why we have people we're tribal by nature, human beings, aren't we? That's why we, football teams, organisations, this badge, that badge, nationalities, flag waving.
But I still think it's the people that make it.
Yeah, absolutely,
100%.
Absolutely. And we've got some of the best people, we really have. And I'm only ever as good as the people around me. And people look at me and I've been really successful. It's been a hard journey. Oh, trust me, it's been an excruciating hard at sometimes. But ultimately, I'm only going to be ever as good as the people around me. And how do I get better? Well, by supporting the people around me to make them better.
Yeah.
And that's at every level. And I know it's a cliche that, my door's always open, but I will listen to anyone and talk to anyone. And I think it's only the right we do that. Because actually, like I said earlier on in this discussion, that some of the best ideas come from anywhere. And, I'm really proud to make a difference. And my wife always finds it odd that when I'm out and people ask, they don't know what I do, I just say I work for the fire service. I don't tell them what my position is. I just say I work for the fire service. And the reason I say that is because it's not about position. It's not about authority. It's not about, I could sit there and go, I'm the assistant chief. I know I'm temporary post. But it's not about that. It's about the fire service. And if people want to probe me and go, what's your role? I'll tell them, I do this or do that. And it's interesting. But I say I work for the fire service because actually it's not about any one level of rank or hierarchy. It's about us as a collective.
I think I'm going to steal that. I think I'm going to use that. Karl, in terms of acknowledgement, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I really appreciate it. I love that we've gone in 1,000 directions there, and I know people are going to take value from it. Thank you for your time.
No, thank you. It's been a fantastic experience. I've enjoyed every minute of it.
The Firefighters podcast is a global podcast seeking to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operators. Through a series of wide-ranging conversations celebrating those within our sector, we seek to encourage and support this incredible group of people. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield, and I speak with individuals from all walks of life who I sincerely believe can add value to or develop those who have chosen this life path. Please support your emergency services wherever you are in the world, and thank you for listening.